Yo, welcome back to Alpha Omega University. Welcome back to every single one of you that keeps on showing up. I appreciate you guys. All right, we got a few things to talk about today before we get started on the episode. Today's episode is episode 10, the Zerg Spear. If you were here trying to watch the episode 9, the Zerg's Armor, that one we actually did it on Monday. We ended up skipping the VOD review Monday that day because tomorrow there's gonna be no stream. All right, so tomorrow I'm not gonna be here. I'm not gonna stream. So we're doing basically tomorrow's episode today, and today's episode was already done on Monday. If you didn't catch it and you want to watch it, make sure you guys head on to the YouTube. It's already uploaded there. I know some people were having questions about it and they were asking me, so that's why I'm just letting you guys know right now. The Zerg's Armor is the video's already up on YouTube, so you guys can watch it there. And again, no episode tomorrow. All right, the next episode we're gonna have is gonna be VOD review Monday, back to normal. It's gonna follow the schedule as the schedule is. Okay, we just kind of had a little hiccup on the schedule, but as of Monday, we're gonna be back on schedule. All right, so VOD review on Monday. Also, I'm thinking about doing a kind of like a news section on the VOD review Mondays. Okay, because I know a lot of you guys don't stay up to date or don't know about certain changes that happen to combat mechanics and things like that in the game, right? So depending on how I do it and things like that, I don't know when I'm gonna start doing it, but at some point I'm gonna do a section at the beginning of VOD review Mondays where I'm gonna talk about any changes that happen to the game when it comes to ZVZ, right? So I'm not gonna talk about any changes that happen to the game as a whole that really doesn't affect ZVZ at all, right? I'm gonna talk about things that affect ZVZ, whether it's anything to do with castles or territory ownership or certain weapons, nerfs, buffs, or how they announced recently in the dev talk that they're looking into doing a new line of weapons, right? Things like that. So we'll be looking at that kind of news that will affect the gameplay that we have on ZVZ, because that's literally what we all look at, right? And so we got to be able to be prepared for the waves of changes that happen in the game, just like the change that happened recently with the Behemoth, right? Where if you don't know, the Behemoth, the E no longer can be thrown and stacked, right? You can't have multiple Behemoth E's within a 30-meter radius. So if you throw your Behemoth E, it kind of acts like the Duskweaver armor, where it destroys all the other Behemoth E's in a 30-meter radius, right? So this kind of like a little talk about changes and combat mechanics and things like that, I'm gonna add it. I don't know if I'm gonna add it on Monday, but probably by next Monday, I'm gonna be giving little updates on the news and stuff. That way, you guys can stay up to date. I look at all these things anyway, right? But you know, I want to make sure I bring you guys the information. That way, you guys don't have to go around looking for information all the time on your own, right? You guys can just tune in, listen to the news real quick, whatever's going on in the week, and then you guys can move on with your lives, right? So it's all about making it easier for you guys. So today's episode is episode 10, the Zerg Spear. I already talked about it. Last time we did the Zerg's Armor, and that was all about the tanks, right? Different kinds of tanks, clump tanks, disengaged tanks, scout tanks, kite tanks, things like that. We talked about the tips that we can give for each individual style tank, the differences between them, because a lot of people don't understand that there's actually very big differences between, especially like disengaged tank and kite tank, right? But even other people don't know that there's differences between like clump tank and like disengaged tank, right? And I'm talking about the newer people in the game. A lot of people just don't know that, right? So I had to explain all that stuff, make sure that you guys understand it, the play style, the positioning, and again, the tips, right? So we talked about all of those things when it came to the Zerg's Armor, which was the tanks. Today, we're talking about the Zerg Spear, right? So the Spear of the Zerg is obviously the damage, right? The DPS rolls. So we're going to be talking about DPS rolls today. We're going to be talking about breaking them down in 4 sections, just like we broke down the tanks in 4 sections. We're breaking down the DPS in 4 sections. We're going to talk about melee burst DPS. Then we're going to talk about melee dot DPS, so damage over time, right? Then we're going to talk about ranged burst, and then we're going to talk about support DPS. Now, there is a section, right, that is like ranged dot, like ranged damage over time. Okay, there is a section like that. But the thing about it is that there is no consistently good options for ranged dot damage. So like one of the only ones that is like ranged dot damage that is actually decent is Great Curse. I think it's called Great Curse. I can't even remember the fucking name of it, man. But it, honestly, it's not even that good, right? Like I'm just saying it's decent-ish, right? And that's about it. Like beyond that, there's no weapon that really does consistently good AoE damage over time. Ranged weapons do have, especially ranged weapons, more than melee weapons, but ranged weapons do have a lot of really good Qs and Ws that do a lot of significant damage over time. Okay, but the thing about it is that you're not gonna play, say, like a Brimstone to do damage over time with a single target Q and I don't know, the fireball or the fire wave, whatever they call it now, right? Like you're not gonna do that. Like it just doesn't make sense. If you're playing Brimstone, you're playing for the E, obviously, and there's not a lot of E's that are ranged that are not burst, right? Most ranged E's are burst, so that's why we don't have a ranged dot type, but we do have a support DPS, and that's at the very end. Okay, and I purposely put the support DPS role at the end because I need you guys to understand the main difference, and this is going to be the key to today's episode, right? The key to today's episode is differentiating between different roles of DPS, because very often we tend to conflate the DPS options, and we just say they're all DPS. Yo, never mind. What's up, man? Oh, by the way, if you guys got any questions or anything, I am watching the chat, so drop it in the chat at any point in time, right? Don't feel like you're interrupting me or anything. Like, just I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the back and forth. And at the end of the day, this is to make sure that we're teaching as many people as possible, right? So if you get confused by anything, or even if you disagree with something, make sure you drop it in the chat. I don't mind disagreements. We can talk about disagreements, but at the end of the day, it's like I've said before, like this is my opinions, right? If you have a different opinion on something, then that's just a different opinion. But if you just think I'm playing out wrong on something and like you want to kind of correct me because I'm misinformed or something, then that's great. Let me know, because I learn a lot from other people, man. I'm not, I don't know everything. I literally don't know everything. Like I learned so much from everybody. So anyway, so the key to the episode today is going to be about the support DPS, right? Because so many people, we look at DPS as one big group and we're like, yeah, DPS, yeah, they're all gonna do DPS, and if you don't do DPS, then you're doing wrong. It's like that's completely incorrect, right? And I've actually had multiple conversations with many people recently, specifically talking about this issue, where people kind of think, oh, well, this DPS type is useless, like things like permafrost, right? It's like, oh, perma is not that good because it doesn't do that much damage. And it's like, that's a wrong way to look at it. Right, that's so wrong to look at it, because permafrost does not play the role in a Zerg of being the big damage output, right? It's not supposed to. Okay, it's inherently different. It's a support DPS, and that's what I'm going to talk about, is the differences between all of these different types of DPS, because we need to be able to break them down and individually look at these weapons, individually look at these builds, and look at what they bring to the Zerg, as opposed to just be like, yeah, you're all DPS, and just blanket them all as DPS and be like, yeah, you're all DPS, so you're all supposed to just do damage. And it's like, not quite, right? They're all supposed to do some damage, but how much damage depends on what other utilities they bring to the table. And that's exactly the difference between, again, melee burst, melee dot, ranged burst, and support DPS, right? So let's get into it. The first one is going to be melee burst, okay? And I'm starting with melee burst because, like I said from previous episodes, it's the meta right now. So it's what everybody understands, right? So it makes it easier to kind of get you guys in the understanding and the mindset if you guys are talking about the things that you guys already understand right now. So with melee burst, the weapons that we're going to talk about are so Galatines is melee burst, right? Because it's melee and it all pops at the same time. Kingmaker is burst, but because of its low cooldown, it technically can also be a little bit of like damage over time, but it's not really used as damage over time. So that's one very big important defining factor to what we're looking at here, right? When we're looking at these weapons and these kits, this gear, this helmet, chest, boots, the whole thing, right? When we're looking at everything individually, we have to pay attention to how it's used, not necessarily what their cooldowns are or what they even say, right? Just because something is a cleanse, like the arcane cleanse, just because it's an arcane cleanse, just because it's a cleanse, doesn't mean it's always being used as a cleanse only. Sometimes it's literally just being used to speed people up and make them faster, to move your Zerg faster around the field, right? So those things are very, very important to understand. So with Kingmaker, that's very important because Kingmaker, if you were to use that cooldown every 20 seconds, and let's say you also use like a pork omelet, right? Then all of a sudden your cooldown is like 17 seconds. You have a 17-second melee weapon. That's kind of damage over time, right? Especially if you're using it as soon as it pops. But the thing is that people, primarily the ones that use Kingmaker, they don't use it that way, right? They use it just every 30 seconds on the engage, or if they happen to see a good clump, things like that. So these are bursts. They're just bursts because they're on a time schedule of like 30 seconds. They're not necessarily dealing lower damage over time. They're dealing higher damage in one hit. Okay, that's the difference. So Galatines, again, obviously, it all hits in one go. Kingmaker, it hits in one go usually. Realmbreaker is another melee burst because it does do significant damage if it's used with cloth, okay? But Realmbreaker is one of those that can fit two rolls, right? It fits 2 rolls because it does do just enough damage with a cloth to be considered a melee burst. But if you're using cloth, but at the same time, that damage is, it's just at that borderline. And it's like I struggle to find the position for the Realmbreaker. It's either melee burst or it's support DPS. Okay, and we'll go into support DPS later, but essentially, Realmbreaker's damage on its own is not just pure damage. It's not just pure big hit, right? There's a utility aspect to that, and that utility aspect from the Realmbreaker is the fact that it reduces max HP and technically like the HP that they currently have of the enemies by 15%. It used to be 20. They just nerfed it recently. It's now 15%, which is still great, right? It's still great. So Realmbreaker is more for utility than for damage, okay? But it's still technically a burst because it's all hitting in one go. Raven Strike obviously is one big engage, right? You channel it for like 2 seconds or however long it is, and then you hit it all the damage in one hit in a big large AoE. Spike Gloves, same thing. You're hitting it all in one go, right? And think about Raven Strike and Spike Gloves. They have something in common. They're both gauntlets, right? They're both war gloves. But the thing with Raven Strike and Spike gauntlets are generally all gauntlets, right? What they have is that their Q and W, it's so interesting because they call these the brawler weapons, right? The brawler gloves, right? That's what they call them. The brawler gloves. And honestly, they're not brawler at all because they don't do much damage with their Q and W. Their Q and W are great for utility, right? And I've said that before, utility, right? And they're great for utility, but they don't bring a lot of damage to the table. The Q and W, I don't care which Q and W you use, from all of them, they just don't do that much damage. And so the gauntlets, it really all comes down to the E and only the E. And the E for Raven Strike and Spike are both burst. The next one is Demon Fang. So Demon Fang again has a pretty much useless Q and W when it comes to like damage over time. The E does hit 3 times, but nobody ever uses it that way, right? For the most part, everybody like, when what I mean by that way is like by hitting 1 time and then like letting the cooldown with the lower cooldown go, and then hitting it a second time later with like after like a 6-second cooldown, 7-second cooldown, whatever it is, right? Nobody actually uses the Demon Fang that way. Again, it's about how it's used, not about what it says on the skill. The skill says that you can just use 1 E of the Demon Fang, wait like 6 seconds, and you can use another one, right? And just keep doing just 1 rotation at a time. But nobody uses that way. Demon Fang is used as a regular burst damage where they use 1, 2, 3 right off the bat, hit the clump, and then get the fuck out, right? So that's what Demon Fang is used. And the Q and W are not very useful when it comes to damage over time. So it's melee burst. Bridled is clear. I mean, Bridled is absolutely clear cut. Like it's just 1 big hit. It's very simple, right? And in fact, it even makes you jump backwards. So it even helps to like get you out away from the enemy, right? Yesterday or 2 days ago, I was in a ZVZ in a castle, and I was like 40% HP, and I thought I was safe, and then some Bridled cloth came in and just clapped me with 1 hit, killed me. I'm like, They actually do good damage, man. A lot of people are a lot of people don't like Bridled. I don't understand why, man. They do good damage. They really do. Demon Fang does good damage too, but I don't know. Bridled does it in one hit. Demon Fang has it 3 hits, right? So if you get stunned or anything like that with the Demon Fang in between, right? I don't know. Boharding, what's up, man? They say they still have 75% res pen. Bridled? Does Bridled still have 75? I thought they brought it down when they brought it down Demon Fang. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I mean, if that's why, then that's definitely why I got fucking clapped, man. Because I'm a tank, right? So 7-3, 8-3. Nah, it's still 70. Oh, then yeah. I just listen. I'm anti Demon Fang in general, right? I just don't think Demon Fang is that good. I just don't. I see the viability. I just think that there are better options, and I think that Bridled is a better option. But obviously, in certain aspects, right? In certain aspects, like they're obviously you can't just be like, oh, I'm gonna switch every Demon Fang for a Bridled. No, you're gonna have a totally different Zerg, and your Zerg is gonna operate differently. It's gonna work differently. It's gonna fight differently, right? So you can't just flip them out. But what I'm saying is that all of these weapons, they have something in common, and they all kind of hit at the same time. They do big burst in one go, right? And that's the main component of melee burst. Never says under time warp, can allies be healed? Are you talking about Great Arcane? If you're talking about Great Arcane, no. Not that I... No. If you're talking about Great Arcane, I'm 99% sure no. But, I mean, don't quote me on it. Go check it out yourself. But I'm 99% sure that no, the allies can't be healed under the Great Arcane. Anyway, because it makes you invulnerable to everything. So, the helmets that are used with these weapons, right? With the weapons that are melee burst, you're supposed to go into the enemy, clap quickly, and then get the fuck out, right? You're not supposed to necessarily just go and stay there and do anything. Because, listen, I know that right now the playstyle is like you engage with a melee burst Zerg, you engage, and then you go and flood the enemy, right? And I understand that that's the playstyle. It works. It does. It works, but it doesn't work because of why most people think that it works. Most people think that it works because these weapons do a lot of damage over time. Like they're brawling, right? They always say, "Oh yeah, the brawl." You even hear like in AOTV they say like, "Oh, they're brawling because they're inside of each other." But it's like if you literally just turn the music down, just turn all the audio off, and just look at the fight. Only look at the health bars of people while they're quote unquote brawling, right? Look at the health bars. I promise you, nobody's actually dropping an HP, or at least not dropping anything significantly, right? Like there's people dropping a little bit, but like it ain't significant. It's no amount of significant damage. And so what I'm saying is that melee burst, the strategy for all bursts, right? Not even ranged burst, is you engage and then you come right back, right? Because you're not necessarily having any useful Q and W, right? And that's another big part of it. So think about this. Let's go through the list again. Galatines, right? The Q and the W, usually W, they'll use Iron Will, right? So Q and W for Galatines, what does it do? They just build stacks, okay? They just build stacks. And what are the stacks for? They're for the E damage. That's it, right? So in reality, the Q and W, that they don't really have a lot of damage output, and you're not really using them for damage. You're using them for the stacks. Okay, Kingmaker, same thing. I mean, they're the same. They're the same type, same swords. But with Kingmaker, you don't need the stacks. You can actually go and use something else on the W. And the new W is actually pretty good, by the way, for like brawling. It's actually really good, but nobody's using it. So I mean, again, it's all about how people use it versus what we think of theoretically, right? Realmbreaker could be good could have good damage over time. But nobody uses it that way because they use the third Q, which is not good damage over time. And the W, they usually use like the fucking healing dash thing, or they use the one that gives you more damage, right? With the W, instead of using like the internal bleeding or the last W. I forgot its name, but the last W, right? If they were to use either of those and the second Q, right, then they would stack bleeds on people and do damage over time. But they don't, and so because they don't, then it's purely melee burst, right? Raven Strike, Spike, we already talked about the Q and W. Demon Fang Bridled, the Q doesn't do much damage, right? It really doesn't. And people don't really use the Q for damage. They use it for mobility, right? The W, it increases damage, but realistically, the damage that it does, the throwing, what are the throwing blades or whatever it's called? Like, does negligible damage, right? So what I'm talking about is all these weapons that are used have literally absolutely useless Q and W skills when it comes to an actual like brawl type scenario. They're good Q and W skills when it comes to like assisting themselves with, like, think about like a Raven Strike or Spike Gloves, the triple kick. It's amazing for mobility, incredible mobility. I mean, I don't think any other weapon has better mobility than the gauntlets, right? I mean, it's great, but it doesn't do damage, right? And so because it doesn't do any damage or damage over time, then they're just pure burst. Okay. Nevermind's asking, what is the ideal ratio for support tank per Zerg? Usually people run 4 tanks per party. I can't tell you per Zerg because the Zerg is, Zergs can be bigger and smaller, you know what I mean? But essentially per party, a party is a 20-man group, right? So per party, usually that you run 4 tanks, and how you distribute those tanks is up to you. And supports, what I've seen usually is about 4 supports as well. I personally don't think that that's the best, though. I think you should never go above 3 supports per party, right? And that's on average, right? Like a party can have a lot more supports as long as the other parties don't have that many supports, right? But right now, everybody kind of just puts a lot of emphasis on supports right now. Okay, so that's just the way that it's being played. So the helmets that these people use for the melee burst DPS players is, the very first one is Assassin Hood. Okay, Assassin Hood is used extensively right now. I don't understand why people use Assassin Hood so much. It's really not that good. I want you guys to think about Assassin Hood. Okay, if you're gonna be a melee burst player, your job is to go and land your E as quickly as possible on the clump, right? Which requires what? It requires you to be in position to hit that clump, okay? But it also requires you to be able to get in quickly, so like actually have speed, right? Speed buff to get in quick, hit, and then get out, right? Because if you get countered, you're usually gonna die, okay? So those things are important. Now, if you are going in because you're melee, you're going in and exposing yourself to a counterattack, you need to have some sort of like defensives, right? So having cleanses or things that like give you more resistances or things like that. That's what you want, okay? But Assassin Hood gives you none of those. And in fact, a lot of people run Assassin Hood because they think that it's actually becoming really useful. And I showed this a few episodes back, right? I think it was in one of the VOD reviews. I think it was like VOD Review 2. You guys can look at it on YouTube if you guys want later. But essentially, we followed one of Escalation's best Demon Fang players. Okay, this is NGM2. Okay, the player letters NGM2. Okay, he's really good, right? And I talk about like all the things that he does really well, right? But at the same time, he runs Assassin Hood. And then we paused the video throughout different times. Every single time that he used his E, we paused the video and we checked the time on the video. Okay, and what turned out was that literally he was using his E on an average of 28 seconds, right? I think that's what I counted. It was like 28 seconds. I counted it afterwards. I didn't do it on stream, but anyway, you can count it after with the stream, with the video, right? You can see it yourself. But anyway, it's about like 28 seconds. Okay, which is a typical engage, because a Brimstone with a pork omelet is gonna engage at every 27 seconds as well. The only difference is gonna be the Scholar Robe. But I mean, that's with or without the Scholar Robe. I'm saying the E itself, right? Talk about a Siege Bowl, right? They don't need a Scholar Robe. Let's talk about a Siege Bowl. Siege Bowl is the same thing, right? They're going to be about 27 second engages. Okay? So what we're talking about is now you have Demon Fangs who have a lower cooldown, 20-second cooldown. And on top of it, you're stacking a Assassin Hood on it to go and, I guess, to do more damage. I guess that's the mentality. But your E is actually engaging on a 30-second interval. And then people go and say, oh, well, it's actually to reset like the Stalker Jacket, right? Or like the Hellion Hood. Or sorry, the Hellion Jacket. The Hellion Jacket or the Stalker Jacket is to reset those. And it's like, I understand, but if you're using an entire piece of your armor just to reset your chest, right? Like, that's not great utility. I mean, I guess you're kind of resetting your boots too, but like, that's not great utility, right? Because you don't need that, okay? But anyway, that's what's mainly being used right now. It's Assassin Hood. It doesn't make sense to me because the utility is just not there, but people use it anyway. Another one that people use is Royal Hood with these melee burst weapons. And this one does make sense, right? Because it brings the utility to it, because the Royal Hood is stacking your damage. And again, what's your job as a melee burst DPS? Your job as a melee burst DPS is to, well, fucking drop damage on burst, right? Like drop big fucking damage in one hit, right? That's the job of a melee burst. And so having a Royal Hood makes sense. Having a Stalker Hood also makes sense because it does similar to Royal Hood, right? You'll usually see this being paired with Galatines though, but I've seen people running Kingmaker that use like Stalker Hood, okay? I've seen Realm Breakers use Royal Hood, okay? Bridled, I've seen them use Royal Hood as well. These are not like the primary helmets that they use, but because they mostly use Assassin Hood, but Royal Hood and Stalker Hood makes sense because that's their job. Knight Helmet is another one that they use, although not as often nowadays that than it used to be. But nowadays, like, people don't run Knight Helmet too often. But if they are not going to use either Stalker Hood, Royal Hood, or Assassin Hood, they'll use Knight Helmet. Now, I know that there's a couple others out there, especially the new ones, right? Like the Mistwalker Hood that doesn't let you die. Like, it has utility. It's very useful, right? Because you're not gonna fucking die. Obviously, it's very important, but it's not used as much, right? And in fact, I personally think that hood is actually really good, but it's just not used as much. The chest pieces that are used for melee burst are the Hellion. We already talked about it, right? The Hellion jacket, the Stalker jacket, but also the Cleric robe, right? Because especially like things like Galatines, they use Cleric robe because they just go in and bomb, right? The ones that are using the Hellion is because they're trying to play a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more in the face of the enemy. It's because of the style that is being played right now, which is Flood, right? So the Flood style. If you don't understand what I'm talking about with Flood style, make sure you guys check out, I think it's episode 7 or episode 6. It's the Calling Styles, right? And so in that episode, we talked about Calling Styles and we talked about the Flood style, right? And that's the most prevalent style that is being played right now in the game. And so Hellion Jacket and Stalker Jacket makes sense for it, because if you're going to be inside the enemy at all times, then you want to be able to heal yourself with the Hellion Jacket, or you want to be able to do more damage over time on all the guys that are around you with Stalker Jacket, right? It makes sense. I see the utility. The thing about it is that the Demon Fang is the number one that is used, right? And the Demon Fang, but also like other things like Spiked, right? Even Bridled. Well, Bridled actually uses Cleric robe more often, but I've seen Bridled with like Stalker Jacket, right? And the thing is that they're compensating for having shitty Qs and Ws, right? These weapons are having shitty Qs and Ws, and so they're compensating for them because they know that they need to have damage over time. They can't just have only burst, right? But because these weapons have shitty Qs and Ws, they're compensating by having like a Stalker Jacket, okay? Now, the Hellion, it does make sense, because if you're going to be inside the enemy for a prolonged period of time, then you're going to heal yourself, right? You're not doing it for damage, you're doing it to sustain, right? And if you're going to play a Flood style, then that does make sense, okay? But there's no reason to be inside the enemy if you're not doing damage over time. There's just no reason to be inside the enemy. It just doesn't make any sense. You're just making your life harder for yourself. But at the same time, you're making it harder for your enemy, okay? And that's the chaos that we talked about it in multiple episodes ago. We were talking about the chaos to the enemy, right? So those are the chest pieces primarily, right? And Cleric robe, obviously, just for the big boom, okay? Just to be able to hit a big clap, especially Galatines, they use Cleric robe. So those are the three main jackets and robes that are used. For the boots, Royal Sandals are used a lot. Royal Sandals are used a lot. The thing about Royal Sandals is that it gives you more damage, so there's the utility, and it also gives you a good speed boost, right? The speed boost that it gives you is actually pretty long, and it's good. It's a good sprint. It's a good run, right? So Royal Sandals are overall very good. The one problem I have with Royal Sandals, and it's not that you're gonna take more damage. I mean, you take a little more damage, okay, I get it, but you can cancel it, right? So if you're just good about canceling it when you see enemies about to engage you or something, then you'll be all right. But what I think the problem with Royal Sandals is actually its cooldown, right? Because its cooldown is actually 30 seconds, but the cooldown doesn't actually start until after you're done channeling it, until after you're done running, okay? Whether you ran for the entire, what is it, like 7 seconds, 8 seconds, or if you canceled it early, okay? So the 30-second cooldown on Royal Sandals does not start until after you don't have the buff anymore, okay? And that's very, very important, because if you're gonna be running at the enemy and all that, or you're gonna be engaging at the enemy, think about this: you're engaging at the enemy with, like, say, a spike gauntlets, right? You're running at the enemy with spike gauntlets, and you hit them with your royal sandals, and you're like, oh yeah, I did great damage, and then your spike gauntlets E is up again, and you don't have your boots for another 15 seconds, 10 or 15 seconds, right? And I say 10 or 15 seconds because another thing is, people that are running melee burst DPS are usually running like beef stews or some other stew that gives damage, right? Most people are not running pork omelets nowadays. Like, whether it's a pork omelet or like one of the fucking, I forget what they're called, the other omelets, any of the omelets, I should say, any of the omelets, right? The omelets give you cooldown reduction, and most people are not going for cooldown reduction, and so they're instead using cooldown reduction with the assassin hood, right? So the problem again is that you're substituting things because you know that they're necessary, right? Like, cooldown reduction is necessary, but you're getting greedy on other things. So you know, you want a little more damage, a little more damage, a little more damage, and so then you become more and more closer to a glass cannon, right? Which again, yeah, I mean, you're a melee burst, but you can't ever forget that you have to survive. You can't just engage, hit, and then die every time you engage and hit. You have to survive, and that's very, very important. So the other boots that you use with melee burst that I've seen is mage sandals for like Galatines, right? Because Galatines will go start casting their E and then use the mage sandals, and then the E pops wherever the mage sandals drops you, and it's very unexpected, and it's a really good hit, right? So mage sandals usually for Galatines, but I've seen a lot of people use Graveguard boots for all the other ones. Graveguard boots, I mean, Graveguard boots are really good, man. Like, they're slow, but if you have things like Demon Fang, like Graveguard boots pair very, very well with Demon Fang, right? And I know I'm like saying bad things about the Demon Fang, but at the same time, you gotta be objective, right? There are good things and there are bad things, right? So the good thing about Demon Fang is that the W gives it a good speed boost, and so therefore they don't necessarily need a full-blown sprint. So they're able to run Graveguard boots, which makes them immune to stuns, roots, and slows. Okay, and now they still have the sprint because of the W plus the boots, right? It gives them like 130% speed or something like that combined, right? So essentially, you have a sprint of like 130%, but you still are immune to stuns, roots, and slows, right? So Graveguard boots are an excellent pair to Demon Fang. Okay, now Graveguard boots are also a great pair for the gauntlets. Why? Because the gauntlets have great mobility, right? The W, the triple kick, and even the Q. They have good mobility. So the thing about it is that Graveguard boots doesn't have that much mobility, but it gives you a very big utility, and that utility again is the immunity, right? And so pairing Graveguard boots with things like Raven Strike, Spiked, and Demon Fang, it does make a lot of sense, and that's why I see people using it a lot. Royal Sandals, on the other hand, it's a little too risky. It's like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't give you enough bang for your buck, right? As opposed to Graveguard boots, if you're using these specific things. Nevermind saying Guardian boots for melee burst, definitely not. Listen, I love Guardian boots, right? Like, if you ask anybody, man, like about who is known for using Guardian boots, it's me, right? I love Guardian boots, but I would never tell a melee burst DPS to wear Guardian boots. It doesn't make sense, okay? Because okay, you can get away with having no sprint, right? But you gotta understand that the Guardian boots are not a 30-second cooldown, not a 38-second cooldown. They're like a fucking minute, right? And so when you're dealing with like a whole minute worth of boots, man, and they only give you 25% speed boost, I mean, I know that Demon Fang and Spiked have good mobility, but they don't have that much good mobility. Like, at the end of the day, you need a little bit more, right? And it's just not gonna be enough, man. It's just not gonna be enough. So, the positioning for melee burst, usually when you're engaging, you're gonna usually engage from the center middle, right? So you're gonna from the, what I mean by center middle is like the center of your Zerg and the middle length back, right? You're not gonna be in your back line, you're not gonna be all the way in the front, you're gonna be kind of in the middle, waiting for that engage, just literally just right behind the front line of your Zerg, right? And then when you engage, and then after you engage, you want to spread out inside the enemy, okay? If you're gonna flood. If you're not gonna flood, then you just come right the fuck back, and then you spread out, you know, where you were, right? But if you're going to engage the enemy and then flood the enemy, what you're going to do is you're going to hit them and then spread out inside the enemy as quickly as possible. Because what you're doing is then you're taking over the space that the enemy was occupying. And when you do that, it makes it hard for them to counter because they don't know what direction to hit. They might say, oh, I see guys northwest, but I also see guys southwest. Which side do I engage, right? And so when the caller says, hit them in 3, 2, 1, everybody's kind of like, hit them where? Like, do I hit north? Do I hit south? Right? And so it makes it harder. It makes it harder for people to anticipate where to hit the engage. Or the caller might say, oh yeah, hit them northwest. And the caller did a great job saying where to hit. But a lot of the other players were thinking, oh, they're going to hit south. And then they hear, oh, hit northwest. They're like, oh shit, now I'm out of position. Now I don't get to hit the clump in the northwest because I'm out of position. Because I thought we were going to hit the south, right? So that's the goal of melee burst and flooding style, I should say flooding style, is that you're going to hit and then spread out inside the enemy, okay? Now, the tips for melee burst DPS is that you got to use the E quick and then get the fuck out. Whether that means get the fuck out back to where you came from or get the fuck out as in spread out inside the enemy. I don't mean get out of the enemy. I mean just spread out inside the enemy. What I'm saying is hit your E quick and then get out. I mean, get out of that place you put yourself in to hit the enemy, meaning get out of the clump. I don't care which direction you go, as long as you don't get caught on that clump, because that's going to fuck you, right? And one of the major issues that we have right now with the melee burst DPS players, because again, that's the meta, so the majority of the players in the game are playing this, right, is that they're just not quick enough. Okay, if you're a melee burst DPS player and you're wondering like why is it that whenever I engage, I always get caught on the counter engage? I can tell you 9 times out of 10, it's because you were too slow to hit the clump. And you might say, oh no, well, it was just like 1 second. Yeah, 1 second is the difference between getting clumped and killed on the counter engage or surviving, right? And so if you're constantly having an issue with hitting the clump and then getting clumped yourself, you need to try to engage at least 1, if not 2 seconds faster. I promise you, you start trying to do that actively in every fight, start just trying to hit clumps faster. I promise you, your survivability rate is going to get like double or triple. Okay, literally overnight, right? It's so important because melee burst DPS, they rely on speed and mobility as their survivability, right? They don't really rely on like, having good resist pots or whatever, right? They rely on being fast to the point where clumps are not gonna catch them, okay? So this is very important. Be fast, right? If you think you're already fast, you gotta be faster as a melee DPS. Melee burst, as a melee burst. Also, don't ever stand directly in the middle of your Zerg. And I mean, this kind of goes for everybody, right? But especially for melee burst DPS, because melee burst DPS, you kind of want to be at the front because you want to watch for whenever the engage is going to come in. Remember, you don't want to be last to the engage, right? Because then you're going to get caught. I just explained all that. But at the same time, you don't want to be in the middle front of your Zerg, because if you're in the middle front of your Zerg, what's going to happen is you're going to be, if the enemy engages first, you're going to be caught in that engage. 9 times out of 10, you're going to be caught in that engage because the enemy usually engages at center mass. They usually don't engage the flanks of your Zerg. They usually engage the center of your Zerg. So you should always stay clear of that center of the Zerg. Let the tanks take those positions instead, because they can take the hits and you can't, right? So that's it for the melee burst DPS, all right? That's the weapons, that's the helmets, that's the boots, and that's the tips of how to play it, okay? Now we're going to get into melee damage over time, melee dot. Okay, now melee dot is significantly different. Okay, because melee dot is not about hitting the enemy in one hit. Like melee burst, right? You're going to go and engage and converge your entire Zerg on one clump, and you're going to go and all delete that clump together, right? Melee dot is the opposite, literally the complete and total opposite. You, as a melee dot, you never want to clump. You never, ever want to clump. As a melee dot, you want to spread out as much as possible. You want to breathe out your Zerg, let it expand as much as possible, and then just make it hard as hell for the enemy to clump you at any point in time. So your survivability in melee burst is your speed, your mobility, you being able to get in and get out quick. your survivability for melee dot is actually going to be simply being spread like hell, right? Just being really, really spread out, right? So think about like a cloud, like you're just spread out and spreading out over a very big distance, right? And that's exactly what melee dot is, because if you can't get a Zerg clumped, then it's gonna be really hard to clump and dump them, right? So that's the strength of melee dot. And on top of it, because you're not being able to just clump and dump them, then suddenly you're having to go and kill them one by one. So sure, you'll clump maybe 2, maybe 3, and you'll kill 2 and 3. And that's great. That's great. I mean, hey, listen, 2 or 3 kills is great. Take it whenever you can, right? But melee burst will usually want to clump and dump 10, 15 people on every engage, right? Especially on large fights. Melee dot doesn't allow that to happen. So melee dot forces the enemy to play one by one by one. And so it's going to take them longer to kill you. It's just going to take a longer amount of time to kill your Zerg. But here's the thing, damage over time, right? So the damage is being dealt over time, which means that time is on your side as melee dot DPS, which means that the longer you can inflict damage, the worse it's going to be for the enemy, because this is what's going to happen. You're not going to kill, as melee dot DPS, you're not going to kill the enemy on big highlight reels, big clump and dumps, big moments, right? You're not going to kill them like that. The way damage over time melee Zergs kill people is because they drain the enemy healer's mana out of them, okay? It's literally impossible to out heal or to contain the mana, to keep the mana up enough against a Zerg that is full melee dot while they're completely inside you for 10 minutes straight. It's just not going to happen. They're going to run out of mana, and when they do, everybody's going to start dying. It's just that simple. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you got to go back to like season 11, season 10, around that time. A lot of fights were fought like that. PoE fought a lot of fights like that. Blue Army fought a lot of fights like that. And you'll see a lot of people just dropping little by little. The HP just dropped and dropped and dropped little by little, and the healers just couldn't keep up, right? So that's the style that melee dot has to play. So therefore, what is important for melee dot? Melee dot importance is not necessarily having a lot of damage in one hit, right? So things like Royal Sandals doesn't make sense, okay? It's all about surviving as long as possible while putting out damage. So we're gonna see what weapons do that, right? Right off the bat, I'm going to say Halberd, right? Halberd, obviously, because Halberd spreads the bleeds with the E. The E cooldown is actually pretty low, right? If you're using the Q is going to be the second Q, not the third Q, because the second Q spreads the bleeds better. The W is going to be internal bleeding. Why? Because the internal bleeding is another dot, right? So if you're going inside the enemy with a Halberd and you're constantly just dealing all these different dot damages and spreading them to all the enemies around you. And by the way, remember, the enemy makes it easy to spread these dots. Why? Because the enemy is clumping and dumping. So every time they try to clump and dump, they're all going to converge and collapse on each other, right? So they're going to clump themselves. You don't need to clump them. They're going to clump themselves. And when they clump themselves, that's when you go and spread the stacks. It's very, very easy, right? So the thing is that it's slow, but Halberd does this very well. Obviously, the other axes do it well too, like Great Axe and Infernal Scythe. Now, Great Axe got nerfed, so it's not as good anymore with it, right? But it's still okay, right? But Great Axe have become a little bit more bursty than damage over time. Infernal Scythe is good. I know Infernal Scythe is a little more bursty, right? But remember, you're going to be lowering their HPs little by little by little, right? So if you're using your Infernal Scythe on those guys that are getting lower and lower, you're just adding to their death, right? You're adding to the healer's pressure. So melee dot puts a lot of pressure on the healers, right? So anything that puts more and more pressure continuously on the healers is good. Other weapons that are good, you can use the Kingmaker. I mentioned this earlier, right? Kingmaker, if you use a pork omelet and you use the new W. The new W gives you mobility, but it also gives you good damage, right? So these things are very, very important, and Kingmaker would fit that role well, right? There's other weapons like Clarion Blade. Clarion Blade would be very good. Again, remember, low cooldowns, right? And then it's gonna do that damage over time with that W, right? The Q is it's okay. It's okay. It's not great, but it's okay. The W does good damage, and the E has low cooldown, so it allows you to keep on just dropping more and more damage on the enemy. Now, the helmets that you're going to use, remember, the mentality of melee dot is not necessarily to get more damage in, but to survive longer, right? So the helmets is going to be Night Helm, because Night Helm allows you to walk around the enemy for free, right? Judicator helmet is also good. Why? Because if you're able to continuously stop and interrupt the enemy from doing their heals and doing their supporting things, and to stop their tanks even for a second from bothering you, from spreading your stacks, right? Judicator helmet is useful. Also, because you're inside the enemy, Judicator armor becomes even more useful because you're already inside the enemy. Now, another one that I have seen people use before, and it works for some, it doesn't work for others, is Spectre Hood. Now, the Spectre Hood is the one that resets your chest piece, right? Because, again, you want to survive as long as possible. Now, what the Spectre Hood does that the Assassin Hood doesn't. The Assassin Hood resets all cooldowns, but it makes you stop, and it makes you not be able to move, and it's not instant, right? If you get interrupted or whatever, right? And it doesn't reset everything. It just brings the cooldowns down, right? The Spectre Hood actually resets the chest without doing anything. You just reset it. And so what that does is that it allows people to have 2 sets of their chest. And usually you'll see these guys that are running damage over time builds running Hellion Jacket. Why? Because Hellion Jacket gives you the healing. It gives you the survivability. So if you're resetting your Spectre Hood, you're using the Spectre Hood to reset the Hellion Jacket, you suddenly have twice as much survivability because you're going to be healing yourself inside the enemy for literally forever, right? But I have seen other people use things like Stalker Jacket because it does make sense, right? But you're also reducing your survivability. So it's a risk, but it does make sense with melee dot DPS because that is your job, is to do damage over time, and Stalker Jacket does damage over time. The Spectre Jacket was used before a lot until they nerfed it. I think Spectre Jacket is okay the way it is. It's not great at all. It's not good. Actually, it's not even good. But it's not bad. Like, people think it's just terrible. I think it's okay. There are better options. That's all it is. There are better options. There's no reason to go with Spectre Jacket because there are better options, period. Right? I know that other people have used the Graveguard armor for melee dot DPS. I don't like it because the stacks are so unreliable. And then also remember, you're not going for a big clap, so why do you need more extra damage, right? It just doesn't make sense to me, but I know a lot of people have used it because it does give you more survivability because you're basically plate, right? So there's that. Let me catch up on chat here. Nevermind is saying, does Broadsword need a rework? Is it viable? I like running Broadsword with shield. So here's the thing. I don't remember 100%, but from my understanding, Broadsword is either single target or it has a very, very, very small AoE, right? Tell me if I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, then okay, I'll take a look. But to be honest, I think that the Broadsword is just not viable because it doesn't have AoE at all, right? Like it's not big. It's just too small. Like whether the AoE exists or it's a single target. I'm pretty sure it's single target though. Yeah. Jodita, yo, what's up, man? It would be good an episode about food on melees and range DPS. Yeah, I plan on doing an episode on food for just everybody, right? Just like a whole food episode because talking about the strengths and weaknesses of foods as well as potions, right? There are a lot of potions and a lot of foods that are not used that are actually really good and they make sense with certain builds, but people just don't do it, right? They just don't do it. So, yeah, I will have an episode. It's just not in the it's not in the schedule yet, but that's because it's farther out, right? It's kind of like a very remember, we're starting from like really big concepts and then working our way down, and that's gonna be in a few months. But yeah, I will make an episode about that stuff eventually. All right, so moving on with the melee dot. We're talking about the chest. We're talking about the boots now. The boots, again, you want to be able to be mobile because you're moving inside the enemy, and the enemy's gonna do everything they can to try to stop you, whether they stun you, root you, whatever, or kill you, right? They're gonna try whatever they can to stop you from spreading the bleeds and spreading the dot, right? Because the longer that you are stunned, the less you're doing damage over time. Okay, so therefore, having things like Graveguard boots or Boots of Valor makes a lot of sense because they make you immune to stuns, roots, and slows, right? They make a lot of sense. But I do understand why some people could use things like mage sandals or mercenary shoes. Both of them are basically blinks, right? And I understand why. It's because if you do end up getting clumped, you get to jump right out of that, right? So you're not necessarily wanting to have speed. You just want to be able to get out of shady situations where you might die, right? So that's the thing about the boots. But Graveguard boots, Boots of Valor, absolutely important and useful for melee dot. Another one is Scholar Sandals. Scholar Sandals is also really good because it lets you run through shit. But on top of that, Scholar Sandals is actually really important because every single one of these dots damage, you're trading mana for damage on the enemy. And that damage on the enemy is then being traded for enemy healers mana, right? So what you need to do with melee dot Zergs, you are essentially not fighting HP against HP like Burst is. Burst damage is fighting who can survive longer with having more HP. No, melee dot is fighting your mana from your DPS fighting against the mana of the enemy healers. So therefore, having Scholar Sandals is very important because you need to have your mana outlast the enemy's mana. It's literally a mana war, right? And here's the thing. Melee dot has not been used very, very much as a complete and total Zerg in the game, okay? It's been used at times as parts of the Zerg, but it's never been a full-blown dot Zerg. That's never really been done, okay? For the entire Zerg. It's been, at the most, it's been like a 50-50 burst and 50-50 melee dot, right? So what I'm saying is, ideally, as a full melee dot, your job is going to be to outlast the enemy's mana. And so having Scholar Sandals makes sense. It's very important and it makes sense, right? Now, with melee dot, if let's say you're running like because this is what it used to be, okay? It used to be about 80% ranged burst DPS and 20% melee dot, okay? Melee burst didn't really exist. It wasn't really a thing, okay? But it used to be about 2 years ago. It used to be where melee dot was about 20% of every Zerg. And what I mean by that is there was usually about 9 or 10 DPS per party. And out of those 9 or 10 DPS, 1 or 2 were melee dot DPS players like halberds, okay? Now, what these guys did, okay, was they would always position on the flanks. And what they would do is they would just pressure the flanks in order to make the enemy fall back, right? So that way they would control the walls, they would control the movement of the enemy, and they would walk the enemy into chokes. And then when the enemy would get walked into a choke, because of the melee dot DPS, then the caller would full engage on the choke with the burst DPS, and the burst DPS would wipe them up. Okay? It used to be, the fights used to be a lot more about control, right? That's what melee dot is about. It's about controlling the fight, okay? So nowadays, we don't really have any melee dots on the field. I mean, some people run them, but very, very few. It's negligible, right? So because of that, a lot of times it's really hard to just control the enemy movement. This is why very often you'll see Zergs fight each other and none of them can actually ever establish a front line. They're just kind of running into each other and they kill each other, like 10 people drop on each side, and then they keep going and they keep going and they keep going. But like, there's never really a front line established. This is why it's always a big mess, right? So with melee dot, you actually create a front line and you push the enemy front line. As opposed to just go inside of them, you're pushing the enemy front line. So that's basically the tips for melee dot, is to play on the flanks and slowly over time push the enemy. Push them to where you want them to go. You're constantly dealing damage, which means you have to stay on the enemy's face. It doesn't mean go inside the enemy. It just means stay on their face, constantly in range of at least a Q. All right, just the fact that you're constantly putting a little bit of damage on them will force them to walk backwards. Now, if you start seeing them getting clumped, then walk in, and if you see an ability to stack a lot of bleeds on them in one hit, do it. do it, spread the bleeds, and then get out and then do the same thing again, right? Make sure you're doing this consistently. If the whole Zerg is melee dot, then you can just flood them and stay inside of them until they die, right? But if you're only like 20-30% melee dot DPS in your Zerg, then do it slowly. Take your time. It's, again, damage over time. Your only job is to buy time and then deal damage throughout the entire time. And trust me, dot does a lot more damage than burst if you have dot consistently over time. So those are the tips for melee dot. Let me catch up here. Nabermine says, what about tank DPS, brawlers, plate DPS? Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit, right? So like people use graveyard armor and stuff. If you're talking about like people that are like running like demon armor with like a realm breaker, right? That's not DPS. That's basically, I mean, it doesn't do DPS, right? It doesn't hit the minimum level of DPS required to actually call it DPS. Because if they're playing plate, they're not doing DPS. So like a plate realm breaker is not doing DPS. They use the third Q. Why? Because the third Q roots, right? So it's utility. Now, the W, they'll go and use something like the dash so that they can dash in and dash out, right? So they're using utility. They're not using it for damage. They're using it for utility. Then the E is not going to do much damage at all. Why? Because they're wearing plate. So therefore, they're using the E only for the debuff, which is the 15% reduction in HP, which is a great debuff. Don't get me wrong, it's a great debuff, but it's just not DPS, right? It's a clear-cut support player. That's a support player. That's not DPS, and that's not tank either because they don't have the HP that a tank does. Does that make sense? Again, we have to not look at weapons like, oh, this weapon is DPS. This weapon is support. This weapon is what? No. You have to look at the kit, the entire gear that they're wearing, and you have to look at how they play that style, right? What style are they playing that set, that weapon? Okay, just because they're playing Realm Breaker does not mean they're DPS. If they're playing Demon Armor Realm Breaker, that's a support. They're not out there doing damage. And if they think that they're DPS, they're just wrong. Because the damage output is just too low. It's negligible. So, give me a second. I gotta drink some water. All this talking, man. All right. So, the next two parts are gonna be ranged burst and then support DPS, right? So ranged burst. This one's pretty simple, right? I think most people understand ranged burst. It's the same thing as melee burst. The difference is that it's ranged, okay? So you're gonna have all damage being hit at the same exact time, in the same place, at the same time, okay? Like clumping and dumping, that same style, okay? Brimstone is good for that, right? Wildfire is like a budget Brimstone, I guess, but like it's not that good. Longbow is another one. Now Longbow has a lower cooldown, okay? But the problem with Longbow is that without the W, it doesn't do that much damage. Okay, you need the W explosive arrows to do the good damage on Longbow. So that means that the cooldown on Longbow is not 15 seconds, it's 20 seconds because that's explosive arrow cooldown, right? Now 20 seconds is not bad, but here's the thing: nobody's gonna be engaging every 20 seconds with the Longbow. I mean, some people do, but they're gonna be always off cooldown because 20 seconds. You engage with the Zerg, 20 seconds, and then you have your cooldown up again. 20 seconds, you engage again, and then suddenly you're engaging by yourself. And then the next engage from the Zerg is going to happen in 10 seconds. You won't have your cooldowns, right? So if you're going to play Longbow, if you want to play Longbow and you're going to play using explosive arrows only, right? And you're going to try to engage as soon as the cooldowns are up, you're not engaging with the Zerg. So I'm talking about people who engage with the Zerg. Longbow, if you're going to engage with the Zerg, you got to wait 30 seconds. Or, well, the Zerg engages 26, 27 seconds, right? So you got to wait until the Zerg calls the engage, right? So Longbow is another ranged burst DPS, not damage over time. Mist Piercer is another ranged burst because it all shoots damage over a shorter period of time. It just sucks. Mist Piercer damage they nerfed it to the ground. Honestly, they kind of did it dirty. They nerfed it too much, and now the damage is just, it's just not worth it, because you also got to run Scholar Robe with Miss Piercer, right? If the Scholar Robe wasn't necessary with Miss Piercer, I would say Miss Piercer is okay, but the fact that you need Scholar Robe and you can't run Cleric Robe, which Cleric Robe is just better because it has the invulnerability, right? The defensive, and it gives you more damage. Yeah, Miss Piercer is just garbage, but it is range burst. Another one that is actually up and coming right now, a lot of people are picking it up, is Siege Bow, right? Siege Bow is burst, obviously it's burst, but Siege Bow has become more and more relevant, and now bomb squads are coming up left and right. Initially, I saw a Fax bomb squad running Siege Bow. Then I saw Escalation bomb squad running Siege Bow. Then I saw Sex and Flex bomb squad running Siege Bow. I saw Para running a Siege Bow bomb squad. I saw what was the other one? Prologue ran in Siege Bow, right? There's so many Zergs that are running Siege Bow bomb squads, and a lot more Zergs are just running or Siege Bow in general. Siege Bow is becoming the number one ranged weapon to run because of the damage output is so good and the AoE is so good, right? Again, I predicted this months ago. You guys can check it out on the forums where I talked about this stream that I was going to start, right? I posted it back in December. I said Siege Bow was going to be amazing. It's coming into the meta, right? And because of that, guess what? Siege Bow doesn't make sense with a bunch of Demon Fangs on the field, does it? Because Demon Fang wants to play and flood the enemy. Siege Bow never wants to flood the enemy. Siege Bow never wants to flood the enemy, right? So here we have a contrast between them. This is why we're seeing Siege Bow as a bomb squad and not primarily as a main Zerg, because bomb squads get to do whatever the fuck they want. So Siege Bow over time, I think is going to start changing the meta. I think we're at that cusp that we're finally going to start seeing major changes in the meta, and people are going to slowly start reverting back to range. I think the main melee DPS Zerg that we're seeing today is slowly dying. It's already on its last legs. But it's still going to take some time, right? It's still going to take some months. Okay, maybe a whole season. So that's the Siege Bow. Another one that is obviously range burst is Weeping, right? Because it pops and then the whole damage goes in one burst, 30-second cooldown. Energy Shapers also burst. Okay, these are all burst weapons. Here's the thing: ranged burst weapons, unlike melee burst weapons, they're obviously different, because melee burst, you're gonna have to clump yourself in order to hit the enemy. Ranged, you don't have to clump as much because you're hitting at different angles at a distance, right? So melee burst exposes themselves to counter engages much more than ranged burst. However, ranged burst usually run cloth chest pieces, right? So because of that, they're easier to kill. So if you do catch a ranged burst DPS Zerg, you're gonna kill them much easier than if you caught a bunch of melee burst Zergs. Now the thing about it though is that the damage output is about the same, okay? And I know people are like, oh well, what about resilience penetration and focus fire and all that? Yes, I understand. Listen, I have an episode that I will talk about that stuff, okay? But I'm letting you know right now as kind of like a preview. When it comes to the math, okay, hitting a clump that that has a lot of focus fire on it, okay, melee DPS only ends up doing at most 10% more damage than ranged DPS. But the difference is that you get to engage at a distance and you get to spread out at different angles. Okay. Anyway, that's the short and sweet for that episode. But I have a whole episode on that where we're actually gonna break down the numbers and all that. We're gonna be doing a bunch of math. We're gonna be like fucking nerds. So these are the weapons for range burst. Now, one of the things that all these range burst weapons have in common is that they all have, except for Longbow and Miss Piercer, they all have good Q and Ws. Remember, melee burst has useless Qs and Ws in the sense of DPS. They have useful utility Qs and Ws, right? The utility is that they give them more damage or they give them mobility, things like that. But ranged burst weapons tend to have better utility better damage over time. Okay? They tend to have the ability to push enemies away from them. Okay, now let me explain. Brimstone and Wildfire, right? Let's look at Fire Staffs. So Fire Staffs, the single target Q, the original single target Q, is literally the one that does the most damage out of all Qs to one single person. Okay, it does insane amounts of damage very quickly too. Okay, so if you use that one, okay, and then you have the W could be used many different things. You have the W that has the firewall. You can make sure that people don't get close to you, right, with the firewall. Now, if you don't want to run the firewall, you can run things like the artillery barrage, right? The artillery does decent damage, especially if you're holding like certain chokes or things like that. Putting the artillery barrage on tanks and stuff, it helps a lot. It does good damage, right? So those are the options for Fire. Fire has a lot of really useful Q and W skills. If you're fighting like say like castles and things like that, you can use the single target Q that basically turns the new Q. Let's just say the new Q. All right, the new Q has a really long range for Fire, right? So shooting those over walls are really useful, things like that. So Fire is very, very useful and versatile, right? Whereas melee burst doesn't actually have a lot of versatility because they only really have mobility that enables their E. Whereas Brimstone, Wildfire, they don't have to enable their E. They're enabling pushing the enemy away and doing damage over time. Longbow, Mist Piercer, again, bows are not great because of that. That's why personally I don't think bows are great. I think bows are okay. I think they need to add better options for bow Q and bow W. But the W, like basically explosive arrows screws up the entire bow line. And the reason is because without explosive arrows, longbow damage is not that good, right? So therefore you need explosive arrows. But the problem with it is that then that means that you don't have a W, right? So bows kind of got fucked out of having a W just because their damage, the SBI can't make the damage of the longbow E do enough good damage to be good on its own. Because then if you add explosive arrows to that damage, then it becomes OP, right? And I'm telling you because this is literally the sequence of events that happened over years well, it was over like, I should say like 9 months or so of SBI basically testing and changing the damage that explosive arrows did and longbow did, right? This was a while back, right? So essentially this is what happened is they kind of screwed up bows because the explosive arrows were making the bows too powerful. So what they did is they made the bow E damage, all bow E damages, lower because they knew people were going to play explosive arrows, right? So then basically bows have no W. And that kind of sucks, to be honest. The next one is siege bows and weeping. So the crossbows. The crossbow auto fire is the second best Q in the game when it comes to DPS. Okay, the auto fire, the one that shoots like 3 times. Okay, not the little explosive shot. That one's garbage. Okay, the auto fire, the one that shoots 3 times at the same time. So that shit does so much fucking damage, man. And it does it at a good range, and it does it quick. You shoot it, you stand there for literally like a second or less, and then you can walk away. It's great. It's amazing. The W is very versatile because the W, you have the silence, which is not great, but I mean, it's okay. All right. But you have the pierce. The pierce is really good when you want to push enemies away from you. And then you also have the caltrops because the caltrops gives the enemy a slow, but it also gives you a speed boost, right? So crossbows tend to be more mobile if they run caltrops because of that extra speed boost. It's like 30%. It's useful. That same thing goes for the energy shaper. So if you pay attention, right, ranged burst DPS and melee burst DPS, the difference in them is that ranged burst DPS actually has really useful, for the most part, except for longbow, for the most part, they tend to have really useful Qs and W skills. Okay, these Q and W skills allow you to have versatility where you can play differently in different aspects. So if you're playing territory, you're playing castle, you're playing open world, you actually can pivot with these options. Whereas with melee burst DPS, you don't have pivot options. You're kind of stuck to this one play style and you have to follow that play style, right? Now, if that play style works, then you don't have to change it, right? So I'm not saying that they're inherently worse. I'm just saying that for certain play styles, ranged burst weapons are better equipped for those situations, okay? And that's the thing that melee burst weapons are lacking. I mean, if SBI wants to add different Qs and Ws to all those weapons, like the brawlers and all that, and give them like legit good options for brawlers, right? Then I'm all for it, and I would think that the melee burst is even better and more versatile. But they just don't, and they just don't right now. And so that's why ranged burst is much more versatile to all aspects of the game. So the helmets that ranged burst does have is Night Helm, obviously, because here's another thing, right? Melee burst doesn't have channels. Okay, they don't channel their damage. They just instant hit, right? Think about it. Demon Fang, no cast time, right? They just hit. Yeah, you gotta hit it 3 times, but there's no cast time, right? Raven Strike has a cast time, but it's uninterruptible. Okay, Bridled, no cast time. What are the other ones? So Spike Gauntlet, no cast time, right? I know some people use the other gauntlet, the one that punches like 7 times, right? Whatever that one's called. Again, no cast time, right? So all of those don't have cast times, while Ranged Burst does all have cast times. Literally, Brimstone cast time, Longbow cast time, Miss Piercer cast time, Siegebow cast time, right? Except for Weeping. Weeping doesn't, but most people don't use Weeping except for like bomb squads. Energy Shaper has cast time, but it's uninterruptible on its own, right? But Energy Shaper cooldown is really long, right? So that leads me to the next point. This is why Assassin Hood is required for Energy Shaper, okay? Now, Brimstone, Longbow, Miss Piercer, Siegebow, they all require a cast time. So therefore, having something that helps that cast get through is important. This is why the Phase Scale hat, the new hat, is so incredibly important. It's so incredibly useful, right? But Night Helmet is also good, right? I guess it's like a cheaper version of Phase Scale hat, I guess, kind of. Miss Walker Hood is also good for these because right now we have you're gonna die. So Miss Walker Hood allows you to survive, right? You stay alive with one HP or whatever. So it allows you to survive while channeling your E. That's great. That's a direct counter to Demon Armor, right? The more people start using Miss Walker Hood, the less Demon Armors we're gonna see on the field because they're just not gonna be killing people. Okay, so those are the helmets, and that's why they wear those helmets, because they make sense, right? Just like all the other ones, they make sense. The chest pieces that they wear are going to be Scholar Robe and Cleric Robe primarily, right? Scholar Robe for Brimstone and Miss Piercer, whereas you use a Cleric Robe for literally everything else, right? Cleric Robe is amazing because it's a defensive, but it also boosts your DPS, okay? Your DPS output becomes much better with Cleric Robe. So those things are why the Ranged Burst DPS use them, because at the end of the day, you need survivability. Just because you're cloth and you're going to be ranged and you're sitting in the back line or whatever, does not mean that the enemy is not going to try to catch you and kill you. When they do try to catch you and kill you, you have your Cleric Robe that will help you survive, hopefully, if you don't get purged. Now, the boots, I know a lot of people use Royal Sandals, but again, Royal Sandals doesn't make a lot of sense because of the cooldown, right? The cooldown for Royal Sandals is not 30 seconds, it's like 38 seconds, okay? So therefore, the cooldown for Royal Sandals makes it so that you can't engage on a cooldown basis of 26, 27, 28 seconds, right? Because Royal Sandals are slow. So therefore, and also another thing is, when you're ranged DPS, you tend to stand farther back than melee DPS, right? Again, pros and cons. So a con of ranged DPS is that you wear cloth, and that means that you got to stay farther back from the enemy because you don't want to die, which means that you need a sprint. You need a sprint. You can't get away with things like Graveguard boots, okay? Now, I know some people try to get away with Graveguard boots, and that's fine. You can try, but it's really hard. You're making it harder on yourself. You need a sprint with Ranged Burst. So therefore, Royal Sandals is fine for a sprint, but it's not good for the cooldown, okay? But this is why things like Scholar Sandals are also used for them, because Scholar Sandals, again, brings mana, but that's secondary. It's the fact that you're able to run and be immune to certain CC with Scholar Sandals, and then when you get there, you stop the Scholar Sandals, and then you go and engage, right? But primarily, any sprint would work for Ranged Burst. The positioning for Ranged Burst DPS, usually you don't want to stand in the center of your Zerg. And if you are going to stand in the center of your Zerg, you better stand in the very far back of your Zerg, in the center. All right? generally speaking, you want to stand on the flanks of your Zerg, so that way you can engage at an angle. So remember, most Zergs will engage at the center of the enemy, right? So if you're going to engage at the center of the enemy, you want to engage with a different angle than your buddies, because you have the ranged advantage. Ranged allows you to engage at a semicircle, right? So think of a semicircle, and the center of that semicircle is the enemy, where the enemy clump, right? So you want to engage at any point in that semicircle, so that way you're not clumping with your Zerg. So that's basically like the positioning for the ranged burst DPS. Different tips for them is that you want to try to always have the enemy front line on your screen. Now, I say the enemy front line. I don't mean have the entire enemy on your screen. That's terrible. But if you can see like their very first tank on your screen, then off-screen name tags is going to show you their front line. And the reason you want to have that is so that you have an understanding of where the enemy is positioned without being close enough to actually see them. Because if you're too close enough to see them, they're close enough to clump you and dump you, right? So you want to stay farther back, but you want to use the off-screen name tags adequately so that you know where the enemy is. So when the caller calls the engage, you know what direction to engage in. If you don't have the enemy name tags on your screen, or like off-screen name tags, right? You don't have enough of them, then you don't know where the enemy is, and you won't be able to engage in time, right? So that's the next part, is you got to find the best angles to engage in, right? Don't just go in and engage whenever you see the clump. Try to find the best possible angle to engage at. Whether that's like go around the rock east and around and then hit them, whether that means like take a few steps to the west and then engage north, right? Whatever it is, take the best angles. Don't just engage in a straight line. This is how ranged burst DPS die, right? And then the last thing is use your Q and W skills as much as possible. With ranged DPS, you usually have really good Q and W skills. Use them. Use them as much as possible. But don't use them so much that you get yourself out of position. All right? So that's it for the ranged burst DPS. Let's move on to the support DPS. And I know that this is the one that a lot of people are waiting for, and a lot of people are also confused about. Like, what is this like support DPS, right? Here's the thing. Support DPS. So everything I've talked about thus far is DPS that does raw damage output. Okay? They put damage on the enemy. They put the hurt on the enemy. The support DPS do less damage, whether it's significantly less or just a little less. They do less damage than the other damage dealers, but they have utility. And that utility is very, very important to the Zerg. Okay? I've talked a little bit about that utility before. Yeah, man. Appreciate you. See you later, man. So we've talked about that utility before, right? Things like permafrost, right? They have less damage. Think about permafrost has like about half the damage of a brimstone, right? But it stuns the enemy for like a second. Okay, that second is the difference between that clump leaving the fucking clump and spreading out, or getting stuck and the rest of your Zerg being able to punish that clump, right? That is the essence of utility, right? But it does enough damage where you can actually still consider it damage, right? So it's not like a lot of people used to think, oh, perma's garbage, because if you just want to stun the enemy, why not just run a Grove Keeper? Right? This is literally the mentality that people had for honestly for years, right? Including myself. I say people, but honestly, including myself. Like I used to think the same thing. I was wrong. The thing is that having the ability to not only, so here's the thing. Okay, let me explain in this way better. Okay, Focus Fire is a mechanic. I'm just gonna explain it real quick. Focus Fire is a mechanic where the more enemies that hit you, the more defense you will have against those enemies. Okay, and I have a whole episode on this, so I'm not going to give more details than that. Okay, but essentially, the more enemies that are hitting you, the more defense you will have against other enemies that hit you. Okay, so if you have the ability to, if you, okay, let me say this. If you need to stun an enemy in order to have them get hit by your Zerg, whether it's your melee DPS, your ranged DPS, whatever, I don't care, right? You get a clump with let's say like a Hodge. A Hodge gets a clump. Great. What happens after the clump? They're gonna walk away, right? Because they got locusts, they got cleanses, whatever, right? But that means that you're gonna need to have other tanks stun them or root them or slow them, so that the clump can stay there for at least 1 more second, so that your Zerg can hit it, right? But let's say you have a Grove Keeper hit it. Okay, now you added 1 more person of focus fire on all those people, meaning that all those people just got more defenses, right? And then you need to get another tank to stop it, another tank to stop it, another tank to stop it. Suddenly you're escalating the focus fire defense that those players have. So by the time your Zerg actually drops damage, what's gonna happen is your damage is gonna deal almost no damage, because they all have a bunch of focus fire protection. And if you're thinking, oh, well, we run melee, so we have resilience penetration, that doesn't matter. Because at some point, when you have so much focus fire on enemies, it doesn't matter how much resilience penetration you have, it's not gonna do as much as the amount of damage you're getting reduced, man. Right? So you're not gonna be able to kill the enemy. Okay, it's just that simple. So instead of having a Grove Keeper stun the enemy for an extra second, why not have a DPS that can stun them for a second, right? And still do just not as much damage as a Brimstone, but, you know, a decent amount of damage, right? That is what a permafrost is, okay? So it's very, very important that we have things like permafrost. So that's the essence of support DPS, okay? Support DPS bring something of utility to the Zerg that helps the rest of the Zerg ensure the death of the enemy. Okay? That's the support DPS. So, the thing about support DPS, so the weapons, we have things, obviously, support DPS is basically every single pierce. Okay? Carving, Spirit Hunter, even the Realm Breaker, what we were talking about earlier, right, will fit here. Damnation, okay? These are all pierce weapons, and these all don't have as much DPS, say, as a Demon Fang, right? They don't do as much DPS as a Demon Fang, but they're still important. Why? Because they bring something to the table. And I mentioned the pierce weapons first because that's the one that you guys are most used to. You guys think, oh yeah, okay, they don't do too much damage, but their pierce is very important. Yes, I want you to see these other weapons that I'm about to say in the same exact mindset as you see those weapons, okay? Those pierce weapons, I want you to see other weapons the same way as these. Those other weapons include the Bow of Baden, okay? Bow of Baden is really, really good because it interrupts people's channels, right? Think about this. So many weapons have a channel that if you interrupt it, suddenly they're fucked, right? Enigmatics, right? You interrupt enigmatics, and people say, oh, well, you can just run an Eagle. Sure. I mean, Eagle is good, but guess what? Bow of Baden actually does damage, right? Unlike the Eagle, Bow of Baden does do damage. It doesn't do amazing damage, but if you stand in a fucking Bow of Baden storm for a little while, yeah, you're gonna take a lot of damage, okay? It does do decent damage, but nobody talks about it, right? Again, utility. That's the main goal. Another one is I think it's called the Daybreaker. Is that what it's called? I think it's the spear that purges, right? That shit's useful. Why? Because it purges the clump. And if the clump has any sort of buffs that are gonna give it resistances or whatever, you can purge them. Now, the only thing I will say, there's a caveat to Daybreaker. The Daybreaker damage is just a little too low for my liking. Okay? If the Daybreaker were to do more than just purge, say it purged and it, I don't know, reduced healing received by like 30%, then Daybreaker would be fucking amazing, right? It would be fucking amazing. Even without raising its DPS output, the Daybreaker would still be amazing if it did like purge plus reduce HP, or not HP, sorry, reduce the healing received, right? That would be amazing. Ava Gloves also purge. Yeah, that's another one, right? The Ava Gloves, they purge. That's very important, right? But they don't do as much damage as others, but they bring utility to the table. And yo, what's up, Dennis? So, another one is Dawn Song, right? Dawn Song is great, right? Reducing the enemy's heals is very, very, very important to ensuring that the clump dies, right? So if you're able to do damage, and by the way, Dawn Song damage is not bad. Like it really is not bad at all. Dawnsong damage is not bad at all. And remember, fire has a great Q and W, right? So if you have great Q and W, the E damage itself is actually pretty good, and the AoE radius is pretty big, and it reduces enemy healing. I mean, Dawnsong is amazing. In my opinion, Dawnsong should be run in every single Zerg that is ranged Zerg. Now, I wouldn't run it in melee Zergs, but I would run it definitely in ranged Zergs. Absolutely. Because it brings a lot to the table. Again, we don't worry about Spirit Hunters in the Zerg. We don't worry about carvings in the Zerg. We don't worry about damnations in the Zerg because we say they bring something very important to the table, right? So we don't say, oh, they don't deal enough damage, they're garbage. We don't say that because we understand that the Pierce is so important. What I'm saying is these other weapons have other utilities that are also very important, but these are so overlooked. And I'm going to tell you guys something. You guys think that Pierce is so important right now, and that the other ones that I'm telling you about are not as important, right? And when I say you guys, I mean for the most part, the entire fucking game, right? But I want you to realize that there was a time about 4 years ago, maybe 4.5 years ago, okay? There was a time about 4.5, almost 5 years ago, that Pierce was kind of like, yeah, no one really cares about Pierce. Pierce sucks. It's not important. It's not that important. Like, yeah, it's good to pierce the enemy, but like, you know, they don't do that much damage, so it's garbage. The same shit that people argue against Dawnsong, against Permafrost, against things like Daybreaker, and Bow of Baden, the same shit that people argue against those today, people argued about the Pierces for Spirit Hunter, for Carving, for Damnation back then. You understand? So what I'm saying is that there's a double standard in the way we as players look at weapons, just because we tend to think this is good because everybody says it's good, this is bad because everybody says it's bad, and we never actually take a good look at every individual weapon and say, damn, that actually could be really useful, right? That's what I'm trying to get you guys to understand with this entire episode, is that we need to look at DPS as diverse styles of DPS. Ranged burst DPS is not better or worse than melee burst DPS. They're just different styles. Same thing with melee damage over time. It's just a different style, right? And support DPS are also a different style of DPS, and we need to understand where they fit in the Zerg, right? So the last one is obviously Permafrost, right? And I already mentioned that like 3 times today, so I'm not going to mention it more, but essentially Permafrost is very good because of that, right? So the helmets that these people, that these support DPS wear are very, very all over the place. And the reason for it is because support DPS, we literally have melee and ranged. We have pierce, we have stun, we have purges, we have healing debuff, right? All these different things, they're different styles. We have things that are channeled, things that are instant, right? Like we have Bow of Baden that like you shoot it, the first person that hits. The Carving is technically instant, but you gotta stack it, right? So because of that, understanding the helmets, the chest, and the boots that are worn by these support DPS, I cannot go and tell you guys, this is what you need to wear with any of the support DPS. This is what you need to wear with any of the support DPS. I can't, okay? But I will say some of the ones that are used are Phase Scale Hat for things like Dawnsong, Damnation, right? But Permafrost obviously wouldn't need it, right? Bow of Baden wouldn't need it. Carving wouldn't need it, right? Assassin Hood is another one that is used because some of these have longer cooldowns, such as like Damnation has a longer cooldown, right? So Assassin Hood sometimes is necessary for that. Knight Helmet is also important because some of these channel, right? Generally speaking, you just want to ensure that you're able to hit the clump, and you want to do anything that allows you to hit that clump, okay? Your chest piece is, again, it depends on the weapon, but you're gonna look at Hellion Jacket sometimes with like Carving, right? Stalker Jacket as well. I know some people run that with Carving, but you're also gonna have Cleric Robe, you're gonna have Scholar Robe. Again, it's all different, right? It all depends on what style, what weapon you're playing, what utility you're bringing to the table, and what deficiencies you have. So for support DPS, when we're looking at the gear, you really want to take a look at that episode I made a few days ago, or I think it's like a week or two ago at this point, where it was about gearing up, right? The episode called Gearing Up, where we looked at how to make a set that actually made sense, right? That has synergy, right? So if you're gonna play any of the support DPS weapons, you have to look at that episode. So, but again, the boots are Graveguard boots, sprints, Scholar sandals. Some of them use Royal sandals, but Royal sandals again doesn't make sense because none of these make a lot of damage on their own, right? So why would you go and get something that gives you a damage boost if your damage as a whole is not that great, right? So again, synergy. Pay attention to your build. Don't just think, oh yeah, this is what people do, this is what I'm gonna do. No, pay attention to what your build is. Understand your build, right? Like, I'll put it this way. One of the builds that is becoming more and more prevalent right now in the game is the heavy mace with Hellion Hood, right? It's becoming more and more prevalent. I keep seeing it over and over now. I also see like heavy mace with Judicator helmet, but that's only because people are so against Hellion Hood, and they have been for many years. And to be honest, they shouldn't be, because the idea that Hellion Hood was not good is an outdated idea. Okay, again, I don't want to give too much reasoning for it. Okay, but essentially, Hellion Hood is amazing. It's not the same as it used to be. Okay, and it's great. So people just don't use Hellion Hood because they have preconceptions of it that are wrong and outdated. Okay, now because of that, they're using the Judicator helmet. But the people that do end up using Hellion Hood, they use, again, Heavy Mace Hellion Hood. That style of play, Hellion Hood with Heavy Mace, that style of play was like non-existent a year ago. Literally an exact year ago. Just bring the clock back 1 year ago, right? Nobody played it except for me. Literally, I'm the only one that I know that I was playing that in the entire game. And I know because I've been playing it for years. And nobody ever cared for it. People thought it was garbage. People didn't think it was good, right? But now, suddenly, it's getting picked up. And let me tell you, from a year ago today to today, there's been not a single change done to Heavy Mace or Hellion Hood. From 1 year ago to today, there's been no changes. So why is it that suddenly people picked it up? It's because, again, people started looking at it. People started understanding it, right? That's all it is. Right? That's what I'm saying for these support DPS, things like Baden, right? Baden is not being used, but I'm telling you, it's actually really strong. The only thing is that it's hard to use because you have to make sure that you hit the E appropriately and you don't accidentally hit some random person, right? And fuck it up, right? So Bolt Baden has a skill factor, but if you're a good player, Bolt Baden is amazing. It's really, really good. So all those things are important to understanding how to build your gear for a support DPS. The positioning for support DPS, again, it depends on which specific you're going to wear. But generally speaking, you want to position yourself in a way that's going to help you accomplish your goal, right? So if you're a Donsong player, you know you have a range, right? And your AoE is pretty big. So you can kind of stand back as a Donsong player and then just hit the clump from a distance, right? But if you're a Carving, you have to stay in the front. Why? Because you have to get the stacks up. Right? Now you get the stacks up and you're chilling at the front, making sure you have the stacks. And then you got to find the clump and hit the clump with your Pierce before the rest of your Zerg. So all those things will depend on what your positioning is going to be with support DPS. The tips in general for support DPS, in general, for all of them, these are things I can say for all of them. Okay. For all support DPS, generally speaking, you're bringing something to the table in utility that you usually will want or need before the rest of your Zerg engages. So therefore, you need to be the first to hit, okay? This means that, think about it. Okay, Carving is a Pierce, right? Carving is a Pierce. The Pierce needs to happen before the big damage drops, right? Before the Demon Fangs hit, before the Brimstone hits, before the Siege Bow hits, right? The Pierce needs to hit. So Carving needs to hit first, right? Bow of Baden. You don't want the enemy to channel anything that's gonna pop any defenses or anything, right? So you want to hit first. Right? Spear Hunter, same thing, it's a Pierce. Again, you want to hit first. Daybreaker, you want to hit first because you want to purge the enemy and then allow the rest of your Zerg to hit them when they don't have any buffs, right? So Daybreaker has to go first. Donsong, Donsong can actually go in the middle. It doesn't necessarily need to go first, simply because the heals usually happen right after your Zerg engages, right? So the heals, but the Donsong E does last a long time, so you can't hit it first. Permafrost, you want to keep the clump from spreading out, so you want to hit first, right? Damnation, again, Pierce, you want to hit first. So generally speaking, all support DPS, you want to be hitting first. You never want to hit after the rest of your Zerg, because then you're useless, okay? Your utility comes with the fact that you're going to hit before everybody else. If you hit after, suddenly you're not useful. You're just regular DPS, and as a regular DPS, you don't do that much DPS. So remember, one of the biggest things, yo, Sweets PV, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you. Yo, by the way, some people were telling me that they didn't see the little like follow or subscribe signs. It's on the top right underneath where it says the YouTube link and whatever on the top right. It says at AO University, and there's the YouTube logo. And in between that and the castle on the east, I say the east, yo, I play this game too much. On the right hand side, yeah. So right there is where it pops up, right? I know a lot of people say that they can't see it because it's kind of small and stuff. I made it small on purpose because I don't want it to distract too much from like the content, right? Because at the end of the day, like, the content is free. I bring it to you guys for free because I want you guys to learn as much as possible from my experience in the game, right? So you guys 100% don't need to subscribe. Like, this is totally free, and I'm not gonna make it paid at any point in time, right? So if you guys want to subscribe, I appreciate it. Like Sweets right now, I appreciate you a lot because it does help me, right? At the end of the day, making the stream is not free for me, right? There's a lot of things that I have to pay in order for me to be able to get this stream to you guys. So it does help with those costs. I appreciate it a lot. But anyway, yeah, it is there, but I don't want it to distract from the stream. So that's why. So back to the tips for support DPS. Remember, you are not a highlight reel, okay? You're not the main DPS. Like, I've seen so many Permafrost running shit like Stalker Hood or Royal Hood. I've seen Permafrost running Royal Sandals. Like, why? Why are you trying to focus on getting more damage done? That is not your primary job. Your primary job is actually split between damage and utility, right? So having things that speed you up and get you to the enemy faster and securely is much more important than doing a little more damage, right? Because think about it. If you're doing 1,000 damage with a Permafrost E, okay, and I know that's a lot, but like, let's just say that you are, okay? Let's say you're doing 1,000 damage with a Permafrost E, and you go and use the Royal Sandals, then you're adding 15% damage. You're adding 150 more damage. So your total damage is going to be 1,150. But a Brimstone is going to do like 2,000 damage. And then if the Brimstone uses that 15% boost, it's going to give them 300 more damage. Whereas you're only getting 150 damage, right? So what I'm saying is that because your damage is slower, you need to stop worrying about damage modifiers. Damage modifiers are not as important for you because you're a support DPS. You're not a DPS and then a support. You're a support and then a DPS. You understand? So you guys need to stop thinking that you're going to get all the kills if you're running like a Donsong or a Permafrost, right? Think about this. Like, about a month ago, who was it? I want to say it was Sex and Flex, but I'm probably wrong. No, I think it was Prologue. I don't know. Somebody ran a Donsong bomb squad for like about a few days, okay? A Donsong bomb squad. And guess what? They were getting a lot of kills, okay? But ultimately they switched out of it. Why? Because Donsong doesn't do enough damage to be a bomb squad. It just doesn't. Right? You're better off running something else. Okay, so that's my point. Stop trying to focus on kills if you're a support DPS. You're not supposed to get kills. You're supposed to make sure you get there first. So if you're asking me whether I think you should run, say, Graveguard boots that make you invulnerable to stuns, roots, and slows, versus get like a Royal Sandals and you're like a, I don't know, like a Spirit Hunter, or you're a Donsong, or you're a Permafrost, I'm going to tell you, get the fucking Graveguard boots. Why? Because you want to be able to get to the clump as soon as possible without any interruptions of stuns, roots, or slows, right? You want to get there because that's your strength. Your strength is not the damage. Let the main damage dealers do their job. You do yours, right? Focus on your job. So one of the last things is for support DPS, you are very, 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 very important. Without support DPS, most clumps will not die. It doesn't matter how good your DPS players are. Most clumps will simply not die if you don't put pierces on them. Most clumps will not die if you don't stun them long enough. Most clumps will not die if they're not purged of the shields that they got, right? So that's very, very important that if you're a support DPS, don't try to be a hero. Do your fucking job and then get safe. Don't go and try to get all the kills because, again, that's not your job. All right? You're only there to support the DPS. You're not there to make the kills yourself. So, and by the way, if you don't like that, then it's real simple. Don't play support DPS. If you want to get highlight reels, go play a main straightforward DPS, right? Like a Demon Fang, a Galatines, a Brimstone, a Siege Bow, right? Don't go and try to get all these kills when that's not the role you're playing. So, at the end of the day, right, we have 4 different parts of DPS. We need to stop calling all DPS just DPS. We need to understand that they're all very different and they all achieve very different things, okay? And we need to look at them and what they achieve objectively without just thinking, okay, these things are good, these things are bad, and that's it because everybody says so. Bullshit. Everybody is wrong more often than not, okay? And every single time that there's a new meta that comes in, I promise you, it came in because players found out new things that were in the game, but they found out now and they realized, oh wow, we can do these things, okay? The game is still developing in the minds of the players. The players are still exploring the best ways. I can promise you without a doubt, in 3 years from today, we will not have the meta we are having today. In fact, in 3 years from today, the meta from today is going to be called a shit meta, right? That's just the way it is. So what I'm telling you is the meta today is not impeccable and it's not perfect. There are better ways to do things. We just have to discover them. And how do we discover them? By first looking at each individual weapon as their individual tools that they bring and their utility that they bring to the table. Okay? We need to stop generalizing them as all DPS, all right? So, the last few tips I'm going to give you guys for all DPS in general, right? Don't get comfortable, all right? When you're a DPS player, at the end of the day, your job is to do DPS, right? Now, it doesn't mean that your job is to do DPS when the caller says to engage, all right? Your job as DPS is from the moment you dismount, you need to start doing damage, okay? I don't care if it's fucking 30 damage, 40 damage because you're doing auto attacks. I don't care. Do damage. Do damage at all times because guess what? If the fight ends up lasting 20 minutes and you've been throwing auto attacks every 5 seconds or every 3 seconds, that damage over 20 minutes is fucking massive. You understand? And you might say, oh, well, it doesn't matter because, they're just going to heal it. It matters because you just said it. They are going to heal it, right? They're going to heal it, which means what? You're forcing the enemy to respond to your damage, no matter how little that damage is. And if you're forcing the enemy to respond to that damage, then they're giving something up in order to do so. They're giving up mana, right? That's obvious. But they're also giving up position because now the healer has to step up to heal that one person, right? They're also giving up their ability to look at other things that are happening, to prepare for your next engage because they're too busy looking at the person they gotta heal. Right? This is how you destabilize the enemy. Okay? Don't ever get comfortable and be like, yeah, I'm going to just chill in the back and wait for the caller to tell me what to do. Stop doing that. If you're a DPS, be active in the fight. Every second matters. Every auto attack matters. Every Q matters. Every W matters. Use them wisely. Use them as much as possible. But at the same time, don't be stupid and die because you want to throw one Q. That doesn't make any sense. right? It's like, oh, I really want to throw this 1Q on that person, and then you end up dead because of it. Don't overextend yourself, right? Do it as much as possible without dying. All right, so that's the goal. On the other side, right? So completely flipping the tables on this, okay? I want you guys as DPS to be the Grim Reaper. All right, I want you guys to literally be the Grim Reaper. What I mean by that is, I don't mean just get kills. I don't mean that. That's too simple, right? That's too simple. It's like, oh yeah, we tell all DPS, oh yeah, your job is to get kills, DPS, that's your job. And then it's like, yeah, I taught them something today, right? It's like, no, bullshit. It's too simple. I want you to do something better. The Grim Reaper doesn't just kill people, right? The Grim Reaper chooses who fucking dies, doesn't he? So therefore, I want you to be the Grim Reaper. I want you to choose who dies, right? I don't want you to just look at a clump and be like, I'm going to kill that clump. Yeah, I'm going to put damage on that clump. No. I want you to find clumps that the enemy doesn't even know exist. I can't tell you, every single time an enemy walks by through a choke, like let's say in between two trees, and you might say, oh, well, they're little trees. They're not that big. They're not big chokes, right? Okay. But I promise you, they're going to clump enough for you to get an E off on that in between those two trees and hit 5-6 people. You hit 5-6 people. Guess what? That's a lot of fucking damage, man. That's a lot of damage because it's going to be escalated, right? Now, how many times have you guys seen highlight reels of players going and then getting claps on enemies off cooldown? And they end up killing so many people. Why? And they did it on their own because the enemy clumped on their own. The enemy didn't even realize they were clumped. And so what I'm saying is, be the Grim Reaper. Choose what clumps you're going to hit. Don't just blindly say, oh, the caller told me to engage, so I'm going to engage the clump that he made. No, sometimes there's a better clump somewhere else. Hit that shit, right? Also, here's another thing that you guys got to pay attention to. Again, be the Grim Reaper. Choose who dies, right? What I mean by that is, I want you guys to look at the enemy. Let's say there's a clump of 10 on the west, and there's a clump of 7 on the east, okay? And the caller says, let's engage the clump on the west. But the clump on the east is 7 people, right? It's less people. But the clump on the east is healers and supports. And the clump on the west is almost all tanks. Wouldn't it be better to hit the clump on the east? Because you're probably going to end up killing more people because they're all clothies, right? Or at least some of them. And whoever you do kill, you know is a high value target. You know that if you kill 2 healers, the enemy's going to feel it. Because they lose 2 healers. Now suddenly they're losing their ability to resist your engages, to heal off, right? So be the Grim Reaper. Pay attention to the enemies that are engaging, right? Pay attention to the enemies you are engaging, I should say, right? Don't just blindly hit clumps and be like, yeah, my caller told me to hit this. No, you're better than that. If you're a DPS, that is your job. Your job is to make sure that the people that need to die on the enemy side end up dead. That is your job, right? Don't be complacent. Again, don't get comfortable. Don't just be like, yeah, I'm just going to hit whatever clump is my Zerg tells me to do. No, be active in the fights. It's so important. So another tip is sloths die first. All right. Y'all know what a sloth is, right? That motherfucker from like the movie Zootopia, right? Sloths die first. Why? Because the people that move slow, okay, the people that move slow in a Zerg, in a ZVZ, the DPS that moves slow and end up hitting 1, 2, 3 seconds after everybody else, they're the people that are going to get counter-engaged and killed, right? So sloths are the people that are slow and they tend to die first. So don't be a fucking sloth. Be fast. When you engage, be fast. Make your decisions quick. Hit the clumps quick and get the fuck out. Don't stay trying to drop another Q or another W or another auto attack because you're gonna pay the price for it. The last thing is, don't get greedy. All right, it's just very simple. Don't get greedy. Just because somebody is 10% HP does not mean you should chase them and secure that kill. Not all the time, because sometimes you chase them, you secure that kill, and then the enemy secures you. and then you die just because you decided to overextend, right? Don't overextend. Don't get greedy, okay? Make sure you get kills as much as possible, but don't go and try to be the person that gets every single kill as much as possible, right? You have to be reasonable. Be active. Don't be comfortable, but be reasonable. All right. Those are the three things you guys got to pay attention to. All right. So with that, we're all done. All right. I know this series is a little long, right? The last episode, the Zerg's armor was, it hit right about 2 hours. This one's almost hitting right about 2 hours as well. So yeah, these are long because there's a lot to talk about. All right. And there are very important concepts. There are very important things that we need to understand as players. We need to view the game differently, right? We need to stop being complacent. And that's why there's so much to kind of unpack here. But yeah, if you guys got any questions or anything, drop it in the chat right now. And I'll answer any questions, whether it's about what we're talking about or about anything else. I'll answer right now. I'll give you guys a minute or so because I know it's delayed. Again, tomorrow, I'm going to mention again, tomorrow we are not having a stream. Okay, I know it's in the schedule, but don't forget about that. Tomorrow there's going to be no stream. Okay, the next stream is going to be on Monday, and on Monday we're going right back to our schedule. Okay, so as of Monday, you can follow the schedule again. I'm sorry, the schedule was messed up. I decided not to change it because I ended up fixing it just with one week, right? So it's okay. But as of Monday, you guys can follow the schedule. I promise. Yeah, I appreciate you, Starlord. I appreciate you. All right, with that, I'm gonna end it here. Again, if you guys haven't followed, subscribe. Make sure you guys hit the follow button. You don't have to subscribe. Again, the content is free, but it does help me a lot. There's a lot of things that I have to pay in order to be able to bring this content to you guys the way I want to bring it to you guys. That way, it's not boring, right? It's not boring, and also you guys get content that is actually useful for you guys, right? So anyway, I appreciate you guys. I will see you guys in the next one.
Yeah, it can be hard when you grow up. People fill you with doubt, you start